Hello, everybody, and welcome
Yeah,
to Too Late for the Gods. I believe we're live here. I am very happy to have as my guest today the man who goes under the name of AfroNRX on Twitter. He also has his own YouTube site to which I have linked below. This is really going to be an extension of a conversation he and I had on Twitter about a week ago. And I was really impressed with him. He was one of the few people on the thread who had some idea what he was talking about and was extremely eloquent in explaining it. And I thought, this we could have a really good conversation here. We're at probably diametric opposite ends, but what we're going to discuss today is the validity of metaphysics. Is it real? And can ontology be pursued without metaphysics? That seemed to be a point of contention. Um, I'm going to let our guest introduce himself here, and then I'll start off. I'll kind of set up the topic and give my point of view. He will then give his point of view, and after that, we'll just have an exchange of ideas, much as has been the practice here when I have guests on. It's just going to be a polite, informal exchange of ideas. I also need to say that we're having some audio issues on his end. Every once in a while, there's some bad latency, and every once in a while, there's some distortion. So I hope you all bear with me. I may have to ask him to repeat himself once in a while. But I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Afro, would you like to introduce yourself?
yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for the privilege, of and the opportunity to just talk to someone, right, and expand
Yeah.
my knowledge. Because actually, yeah, yeah. So I actually, even though I studied computer science essentially, uh, I also took a minor in philosophy. So when it comes to philosophical matters, I feel as if I'm still on your side. Like there's so much growing for me to do. But then at the same time, I'm growing also in confidence that there's some things that I'm starting to understand that I can now even express. And I believe by comparing my thinking and with the ideas of others, perhaps I can come to a better understanding of the truth. So that's what even drove me to YouTube. Because for one, the people around me aren't really interested in such matters. They are too esoteric. Yeah, and so that would yeah. So it's it's something that I'm enjoying. It's fun. Yeah, thinking about these things and exchanging ideas with others. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly is. I assume your education is more in the analytic philosophy tradition.
Interesting enough, most of my professors were they leaned more towards the school of phenomenology, right? And they really
Okay.
liked comparative philosophy, right? So I was more of
Oh,
the odd one out since I was drawn more towards the analytic tradition, and I found
mm-hmm.
them to be slightly more coherent and more plausible in comparison to the so-called continental approach.
Right. Yeah, which is just the
In
opposite of me, of
particular,
course.
when we were studying, oh, okay, yeah, but it was not that dichotomy when you're learning of Kant, yeah, you're learning Kant, and you're comparing with Hume, and you're comparing him with Descartes, right, and also the
Mm-hmm.
American pragmatists, right, William James, right,
Right.
and so it was in trying to come to understand a certain synthesis of these ideas that made me think that perhaps it's through the analytical tradition that we can bring together these two different schools of thought.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
I yeah, of course, I'm just from the opposite. Although I went to University of Chicago, which their philosophy department is half analytic, half pragmatist. It was actually begun by a pragmatist. And so for my first 4 years, I was immersed in that. In my graduate studies, I was able to break away from that because my real interest is Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein. Those are the thinkers I look to. And today I'm going to be drawing on Heidegger's claim in the contributions to philosophy of the event that we are in a transitional period right now. We're transitioning out of metaphysics and into a time of a more direct, authentic thinking of being and the truth of being, which we don't yet know how to do. We're kind of in no man's land right now, trying to figure out how to do this. I would also point out that the two biggest thinkers of the 20th century, in my opinion, and in the opinion of very many in philosophy, were Wittgenstein and Heidegger, both of whom considered metaphysics and to a certain extent philosophy to be dead. And you know, the question was, how do we go on from there? Heidegger and Wittgenstein had very different ideas how we proceed, but metaphysics was a thing of the past. Today, it still exists in universities, and especially in philosophy of religion. But in universities, you still see some metaphysics. But one of the things to notice is that no one knows what metaphysics is. What it means has changed dramatically since the 19th century, more into confusion. If you look at what's interesting is the article on metaphysics in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And whenever I mention the SEP, I need to quickly point out that it is not a definitive encyclopedia of what's what. It's a collection of viewpoints, opinions of academics, and it ranges from the very, very good to the very, very bad. But none of it is definitive. None of it is normative. It's just simply an opinion. The SCP entry on metaphysics is written by two professors from Notre Dame who are Catholic, almost apologists, but what their area is metaphysics, especially within philosophy of religion. And if you bear with me, I want to read and comment on the first two paragraphs from their article in the SEP, which I think aptly demonstrates the confusion. It starts out, it's not easy to say what metaphysics is. Ancient and medieval philosophers might have said that metaphysics was, like chemistry or astrology, to be defined by its subject matter. Metaphysics was the science that studied beings as such, the first causes of things or things that do not change. It is no longer possible to define metaphysics that way for two reasons. First, the philosopher who denied the existence of those things that had once been seen as constituting the subject matter of metaphysics, first causes or unchanging things, would now be considered to be making thereby a metaphysical assertion. Second, there are many philosophical problems that are now considered to be metaphysical problems, or at least partly metaphysical problems that are in no way related to first causes or unchanging things. The problem of free will, for example, or the problem of the mental and the physical. Before I get to the second paragraph, I just want to make a couple of comments. First is that if you look at metaphysics traditionally over the last 2,500 years, their definition that it was the science that studied beings as such, the first causes or things that do not change, while are correct, they're not adequate. There's a common denominator there, and that is the transcendental. These were things that existed outside the physical world. Second, when they say there are problems, many philosophers that are considered to, well, I'm sorry, that the first things are unchanging things would now be considered, if you're denying that those exist, which I do, that would itself be a metaphysical assertion. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And as the conversation goes on, I'll go into great detail on that. But if we were to approach ontology from a purely physical, not metaphysical point of view, we aren't going to make any metaphysical assertions. We're going to simply speak about what's presented in experience. But that is a common bias within analytic philosophy. Now I'm going to go to the second paragraph, which is where they actually try to deny that metaphysics is about the beyond or the transcendental. They say, the word metaphysics is notoriously hard to define. And I would add, well, it is today, but it didn't used to be. 20th century coinages like metalanguage and metaphilosophy encourage the impression that metaphysics is a study that somehow goes beyond physics, a study devoted to matters that transcend the mundane concerns of Newton, Einstein, and Heisenberg. This impression is mistaken. The word metaphysics is derived from a collective title of the 14 books by Aristotle that we currently think of as making up Aristotle's Metaphysics. Aristotle himself did not know the word. He had 4 names for the branch of philosophy that is the subject matter of physics: first philosophy, first science, wisdom, and theology. At least 100 years after Aristotle's death, an editor of his works, in all probability Andronicus of Rhodes, titled those 14 books Ta Metaphysica, or after the physicals, or the ones after the physical ones. The physical ones being the books contained in what we now call Aristotle's Physics. The title was probably meant to warn students of Aristotle's philosophy that they should attempt metaphysics only after they had mastered the physical ones. The books about nature or the natural world, that is to say about change, for change is the defining feature of the natural world. They almost contradict themselves here, but the confusion is quite obvious. This is a common assertion among people still involved in metaphysics, especially in the philosophy of religion, in that metaphysics doesn't mean the beyond or the transcendental, essentially, but that's false. If you look at how they've described them, it is true that we didn't call it metaphysics until 100 years after Aristotle. It's true. But there is an essence to the difference between metaphysics and physics. And that difference is the transcendental or beyond. Otherwise, there would be no difference between physics and metaphysics. You wouldn't be able to describe the difference. First causes, the unchanging, things like that, they contrast to the natural world. And by implication, they're talking about something beyond the natural world where these things don't exist. Because they don't exist in nature themselves. And I don't think we can get away from characterizing metaphysics as the real meaning of meta, which is behind or beyond. And if you look at older dictionaries, older philosophical treatises on metaphysics, they will always define metaphysics that way, as the transcendental or that beyond physics, that underlying physics, but doesn't exist physically. It exists ideally. Idealism is the essence of metaphysics. I'll explain when we get into the discussion how, but in the 20th century, that became an untenable position.
Okay.
And the 20th century was the century that split everything with the discovery of quantum mechanics. And one of the things that fascinates me, and we'll get into this, is how Heidegger's approach almost coincides with those places in physics that are inexplicable. And that is, anybody who knows me, that is my primary interest from philosophy, is understanding being in this physical world in the way that we can understand who we are as humans and how we relate to this physical universe. And what is this physical universe? And behind it, what is being? How do we approach it? And that is essentially not through metaphysics. It is not through systematic thought. It is not necessarily through reason. It's through aesthetic knowledge. And there's a lot to that. And we'll get into that, I hope. What I want to do is, Heidegger says a couple of things here, and I'm not going to be quoting Heidegger a lot here, but he makes an important distinction that plays directly into what is called philosophy and modern metaphysics, which he sees mainly as misinterpretations of philosophy or misinterpretations of thinking in general. It's been lowered to the point where professors pose as philosophers. And it really is dumbed down to the level where even a university professor could be a philosopher, which is nonsense, but that's the common view. In his book, Introduction to Metaphysics, he says, the misinterpretations by which philosophy remains constantly besieged are mainly promoted by what people like us do, that is, by professors of philosophy. They are customary and also legitimate, and even this is a customary and also legitimate and even useful business to transmit a certain educationally appropriate acquaintance with philosophy as it has been presented so far. This then looks as though it were philosophy itself, whereas at most it is scholarship about philosophy. It was kind of an off-the-cuff interpretation. I hope it made some sense. But what he's saying is that philosophy is something extraordinary. It's something extremely difficult, and it isn't done comfortably. It is done by plunging yourself into, first of all, it's done out of a passion to know, a questioning that's a burning passion, and a plunging into what Nietzsche called the abyss. And for a while, Heidegger called it the abyss also. But it's that breach into which reason no longer gives you the full story. And it's a destructive sort of thing, because what he calls the fire that protects the essence of being is going to burn you up eventually. Nietzsche made the same point, but that's what a real philosopher is. It's somebody who almost sacrifices his being in search of the truth, which explains almost nobody writing in the SCP. And then he quotes Nietzsche as, philosophy means living voluntarily amid ice and mountain ranges. Philosophizing, we can now say, is extraordinary questioning about the extraordinary. And that is exactly, as I will present later on, that is what metaphysics prevented us from doing. And I see the history of philosophy from the Enlightenment through today as the history of overthrowing metaphysics and regaining what pre-Socratic thinking did, which was a meditation on being as it's presented, as it's experienced in this world, which is an extraordinary undertaking. I'll leave it at there for now because I've talked an awful long time, and I want to give Afro his chance to tell us where he's coming from, and then perhaps we can discuss this. Afro?
Okay. Thank you very much. It was interesting just to see the threads that you're trying to gather, right? For me, I would say that I would prefer starting from the place of cognition. So, whereby since you started from the point of the world, right? It reminds me of
Yes.
the whole in epistemology when people discuss the whole idea of the empiricism, right? So, in that sense, we can talk about maybe Hume, but then I think that Descartes or Leibniz were coming in to some extent even Kant, even though there are problems with some of the ideas. That there's something that they pictured, that they captured, that was quite correct. That is, no matter what being is in the world, right? Everything will be filtered in terms of human cognition. So the starting place of comprehending or understanding. So I would argue that philosophy is actually the quest for comprehension. There is something that man is seeking to understand, right? So yeah, so this yeah, so this goal, this quest for comprehending pushes us to first seek also to understand human comprehension, right? And when we're trying to understand human comprehension, we discover what we can say it's a primitive type of psychoanalysis, right? Where there's the irrational element or the unreasoned element whereby we perceive things, right? So there is our interaction with objects. So that's now with the idea of experience, and our capacity to also recognize patterns. And that's still not the only part of our cognition, because the cognition is also filtered. It's given meaning. It's assigned value by either the means of our cerebral system or by the means of our limbic system. So we perceive things and then we think about them, but we also get certain feelings about them. And at the same time we're doing that process, we are also trying to comprehend the thing objectively and subjectively. So even what we, all these different threads you can even see within Heidegger, right? I'm not completely reading Big and Time, but you see when he's trying to make sense of being and he's trying to define things, he's trying to figure out what the object is, right? And he's describing the relations between the objects. So you're seeing he's using perception, right? And at the same time, he's making certain judgments of the things that he's observing. So you can see that he's thinking, right? And even that process of thinking, there's a certain objective quality to it, and there's a certain subjective quality to it. And I think that is universal for all human beings, right? And in some way, it will even tie us to the work of Carl Jung, right? When he talks about extroversion and introversion, right? So that will be that whole thing of trying to see things objectively and also trying to see things subjectively, and with our rational and irrational functions, right? So we are trying to see what things make us feel, what things make us think, and we're doing those things both reactively and proactively. And I think that is the starting point of philosophy. And I think so, therefore, that philosophy is actually our attempt to comprehend. But then what is it that we're trying to comprehend? So I'll add the second element, the objects of philosophy. And in many introduction to philosophy classes, they'll talk about logic, right? They'll talk about metaphysics or axiology, right? Depending on the school that you go to and how they break them up, but you'll find those elements to be there, right? And so for me, it was like now we are so like basically the comprehension can also be described as a reflection. So we also use the term reflection when discussing or defining philosophy. So I think there we have agreement, right? That the goal or the object of philosophy is the use of reflection, but I would say that that reflection is for the purpose of understanding. And in that quest of understanding, we start specializing, we start looking at particular things. And so that's why now the branches of philosophy, that's how the idea of the branches of philosophies can come in. And so I would say that is the foundation. And because we're trying to understand things, we start with the natural world, the physical world, right? And in understanding the physical world, we discover that our reflections from them, that the patterns and the order of the physical world cannot be explained purely from the place of the physical world, right? So that's when you find people discussing strange things such as the efficacy of mathematics in describing the natural world. And that's when I would argue that that's when now metaphysics comes in. And where I would disagree with you that metaphysics is totally an obstacle, or it's something that veils and prevents us from, in our quest to understand or in the quest to comprehend. So when we're trying to understand the natural world, we discover there are certain elements beyond it, right? Either within ourselves or beyond the natural world in itself. So it looks like there are three, at least at face value, we have three spheres. And I would argue that in human history, when we started trying to understand things beyond the natural world, that's when now we have the birth of paganism, right? And that's when we have now the rudimentary form of religion and the rudimentary forms of philosophy of religion. And so yeah, so now we start having philosophies of different things. So you have like the philosophy of war, you have the philosophy of growing food, right? And yeah, so we have the birth of culture, we have the birth of religion, we also have the birth of economics, right? Because now the people will need a philosophy of how to get the things that you need. And then that layer, and trying to understand all these things, you discover that they are unified, they have different properties, they're whole, and they're still operating. So it turns out that even our metaphysical view becomes inadequate, right? And people now want to go something beyond metaphysics. And I argue that's the point at which human cognition started dealing with the notion of the theological, right? And I would argue that that's how even the medievals, right, started describing theology as the queen of the sciences, because in their minds, in trying to understand the physical world or the material world, the natural world, we discover the physical world, we discover the metaphysical world. And in trying to understand the metaphysical world, we discover the theological world. And I think what happened now in the Enlightenment is some of the boundaries that we drew on these things became untenable, right? So why is it that now we struggle to, let's say, define metaphysics, right? And why is it that it becomes difficult to say that, oh, it is trying to understand just the first things? Because there's a relation between the physical world and the metaphysical world. And there's a relationship between those two realms and the so-called theological, whether you argue that the theological frame would be the good of the Platonists, whether you'd argue that it's the cosmic egg of the Hindus, whether you'd argue that it's the God of the Abrahamic faiths, right, or chaos in the Greco-Roman thinking, right? So you find there are all these intuitions, right? And that's the other, and that's why I think philosophers ties to human cognition. There are such intuitions you get when you're dealing with these things, right? And those intuitions lead us to certain areas of explorations, which generates a new set of intuitions, which also creates now a new form of exploration. And so because all these things overlap and feed into each other, there isn't such a clear boundary, right? And here I would now borrow like a certain idea of from the philosophers when they talked about when they're trying to describe the divine, right? And they're talking about the divine being perfectly simple, but it's a strange type of simpleness whereby it's the realm where truth looks like beauty, and at the same time beauty looks like virtue, and at the same time it looks like all these other sets of the properties. So I think what they are putting a finger on is that in our in our exploration of reality and all these other meta factors that follow our exploration of reality, there's this convergence point, right? There's this point where everything is unified. There's this ultimate source, ultimate core. And because we are using human cognition and we're starting from the point of the human cognition, we'd end up having disagreements, right? And I think that's why we will not be able to have perfect consensus. And I think now in the entry that you are discussing, in the entry in metaphysics, I suspect the reason why they were saying it's hard to define is rather what they should have said. It's harder to come to a consensus, because even though we can identify the object of study, we struggle with what the boundaries are, right? And we struggle with the subjective elements that we introduce into the study, right? And so you have metaphysics. And what's the object of metaphysics? Metaphysics is actually trying to understand the fundamental thing, right? And what is the fundamental thing? maybe it's a type of being, as it happened in Western thinking. The most fundamental thing is a being, right? But then in Eastern philosophy, particularly under Taoism, they try to argue that the fundamental thing is a process, a dualistic process, right? Which the Chinese use the term Tao to describe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in Hinduism, they describe something called like a cosmic egg, and it's this way that they call samsara. So there's this weird cycle that governs everything. So in Eastern philosophy, they tend to see process being more fundamental than being, which I think is such an odd assertion. But it's an intuition that there's something that they're trying to put a finger on. And I think those of us who are from the Western tradition, we can actually help them see that being precedes process, right? For process to be there needs to be a particular property. So being is necessary. So we actually want to tell them that being is most fundamental. So because we have not come to that point of consensus, right, that metaphysics now becomes difficult to define. Yeah, so we want to understand, we want to reflect upon what the fundamental is. But then what is the fundamental? And we're having a fight about what the object of metaphysics is, and that becomes a problem. And if you notice also the period that you spoke about with with Heidegger and Wittgenstein, right? Okay, I can't pronounce his
Mm-hmm.
name. Wittgenstein, yeah, Wittgenstein. You also notice that's also
Wittgenstein,
like the
yeah.
period of the, yeah. It's also that same time period, like it's just after Bertrand Russell, and it's at the peak of the positivist movement, right? It's at the peak of the positivist
Yes,
movement.
Well, it was there was atomistic positivism. They came sort of out of logical
Yeah,
positivism, but slightly different.
yeah,
And Wittgenstein was one of the creators of that type of philosophy and came later to reject it
yeah.
entirely, along with all metaphysics.
Yeah. I think that culminates in the tractors, right? So I think it's
Mhm.
the famous work would be tractors. And yeah, so
Well,
you find
that
that
was
all
his
well, yeah,
original. That was his early work that set up atomistic philosophy,
yeah,
where he posited that the world
yeah,
the was a collection of facts, what is the case, and can be understood through logical relations of those facts. He came to explicitly reject
yeah,
that in his later writing. The philosophical Untersuchungen, philosophical investigations, um, and the Blue Book, especially,
yeah,
he completely negates the Tractatus. It's an entirely different approach that he considers that the last step of the danger of metaphysics, and now the only role for philosophers is a therapeutic role of unraveling all the unnecessary knots that metaphysics tied us to. The world does not. I mean, and this is, somewhat related to the quantum mechanics and the discovery that the world was not as we thought. And he came to realize that the world is pure becoming. There are no set facts, and logical propositions aren't going to get you very far. And the role of the
yeah. So you
philosophers is
know,
he's. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh yeah, yeah. So you see, with all those threads, it's because initially he thought he found the fundamental thing, right? He found the fundamental truth. Then he realized that there's actually something beyond that, right? And so that's what I'd argue. That's where now the yeah. So yeah. So with that first point when he says that he found the facts, like the world is the basic facts. He thought he's found
Mm-hmm.
the fundamental thing, but he hadn't. There was something more
I
fundamental, and
would
therefore he moved on.
I would say that he would deny there is a fundamental thing,
Oh, okay.
but we can go into that more later. Um, you said, first of all, I'm sure everybody can understand now why I was happy to have you on this show. That was fascinating. Um, rendition of where you're coming from, and it leaves us so many things to talk about, more than we will be able to get to today. And maybe today we just get down to narrow down to the few things we would want to continue on at another time. But the first thing I want to address, because it gets to the heart of everything, is your discussion of how we view things rationally and emotionally, and that they sort of split off, which is, that's a
Yes.
very interesting comment, because it wasn't always that way. Um, if you look at the pre-Socratics, they preceded metaphysics. This was all purely physical. Even religion was physical. If you look at, if you look at Pythagoras and his Dionysian ecstasy, for him, everything was about music, which he saw as the fundamental physicality of the world, and his worship of Dionysus as a physical force in this world. And what man was meant to do was experience this physicality in the ecstasy of Dionysian revelry to get to the foundation of truth. I mean, even his geometry was simply to understand the vibrations of a string and how music works, how resonance takes place. That's what he was about. It was purely physical, and his religion had no metaphysics to it whatsoever, nor with Heraclitus or any of the pre-Socratics. Until you get to Socrates, or the time of Socrates, when the Greek, what the pre-Socratics were looking at was the Greek word physis, which was a combination of what could be understood rationally and what had to be experienced physically. They didn't make that. It was a felt thought. It was a meditation. It was a listening. It did not split reason from feeling. It happened with metaphysics. Go into Heidegger's, example of it was the switch from A is A to A equals A. And that was a split that was more powerful than the splitting of the atom in the 20th century, because it split us. It split us in our essence, in our nucleus. What it did was, A is A means it is, the is not a mere copula. It's the major world. It's being. It's A is A in all of its being that we can experience as it's given to us. A equals A does something extraordinary. It splits those two off. It means that in the phenomenal world, everything is equal. I can equal everything out, and I can describe it mathematically. And what you don't have is essence anymore, or being. What you have are a bunch of representations, all equal to each other, because their essence has been removed to a metaphysical plane outside of the physical world. Platonic idealism is that. Aristotle's first cause is that. It's stuff that the real essence is outside the physicality. We only perceive the physicality as we sit in our cage, our cave. But what we have done for 2,500 years is sent us on the mistake of comparing material and immaterial. And what we're learning is the question itself of material versus immaterial is an illusion. There is no split, and there really is no material. There's a physical. And the physical is very different from what our representations tell us it is. But our representations can serve as a guide. First of all, representation has a practical it has a practical implication. It's very important for survival. Technology, science comes from that A equals A. And as far as it goes for practicality, it's useful. but it isn't true. It was never meant to get us to truth. As Heidegger says, subjecting being, to that would be to subject it to the acid bath of logic. You take it down to its bones, but the being is gone. But it does have practical import. And then all the things that concern being get shoved off into this non-physical, immaterial realm of the imagination. And the problem that it turns out to be is it's groundless. There is no grounding metaphysical thought. It's all pure conjecture derived from what we have observed objectively. And so we have this object-subject relationship, and from that we are trying, which doesn't even exist. In the pre-Socratics, there was no object-subject. There was an an entangling within an event. And that's what Heidegger wants to get back to, is meditation or Andenken of the whole, not reduced to the acid bath of logic. But we don't know how to do that anymore because we've lost being in the metaphysical. I'd be interested in your response to that.
Okay. So what I would actually the same critique I would have for Heidegger in that regard is the same critique I have of August Comte, right?
That was Heidegger's
I think what he's doing is that yeah. So I'd say that actually he is going back, right?
Yes.
Because the thing is, the reason why those steps happen, or rather, the reason why those steps happened was because you realize there's another layer to what you're dealing with, right? And we also realize that we cannot understand the whole. We cannot understand the whole simultaneously, right? I cannot understand the entire cosmos in my reflection without focusing, without narrowing down my focus. Right?
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I know you've got more, but let me just. Okay, go ahead. Then
remember the point I was making about cognition. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The narrowing.
So it's impossible for human cognition to grasp the. Because it's impossible for the human being to grasp the entire cosmos. He has to narrow down his focus towards particular things, and then he has to reunify them all. And that's why we have got these different specializations that emerge, right? And that's why we have all these different layers. But I'd say that is just a natural product of our cognition.
That would be, however, the mistake of the 2,500 years. It's not about just cognition. It's about experience. We're not looking, but let me go back to the cosmos, because that's a different question from what I was getting at, but it's another important one. And what we know now, especially in quantum field theory and Carlo Rovelli's writings from the perspective of quantum gravity, is that there essentially is no order fundamentally in the universe. It's an interplay of the waves of the quantum fields. So everything is always becoming, and it's always instantaneous interplays that sometimes cohere into a resonance, and we see that as a thing, and then it disintegrates again. But what these waves are constantly doing is churning up cosmic foam, or spin foam, as Carlo Rovelli calls it, and those are basically the particles and the antiparticles, and they come and go, and they relate to each other, but nothing causes anything. There's no causality. There's just mutual relationships that come and go. You could never comprehend it because there's nothing really to comprehend. The only way we can make sense of things is by blurring. And that means becoming blind to 99.9% of what exists and focusing on a few events in which we relate, we're part of a subsystem. It just very few events now suddenly look like an order. They're not in order. We intuit that, but we do that within relationship to it. And that's what opens up space and time in an appearance of causality. And it's fleeting. But if we were to unblur, if we were to start to sharpen it so that we see everything again, what we thought was an order, it dissolves right back into the chaos of the foam. It was something we intuited. It wasn't real. But that's from the scientific, not the philosophical approach. What that's telling us really is mathematics doesn't explain the universe. The universe is non-computational. There is no first principle such as causality. It doesn't exist. If there's something that's elemental, we'll never know what it is, because all of this really interesting stuff takes place outside our modes of comprehension. We intuit space and time, which isn't really there, and we understand it when we're looking at it objectively on the A equals A axis. What we're looking at then is everything has to be fit into an order. We've got the identity principle, the non-contradiction principle, and causality, none of which actually exist. And when we come out of our small frame that we have evolved in, which is essentially Newtonian physics, the realm that's explained by Newtonian physics, our understanding becomes totally unable to comprehend. 100 years after the discovery of quantum mechanics, we still have no idea what's happening. We have no valid interpretation and probably never will, because our capacity of understanding founded in space-time and causality has no application at that level. So instead of looking at the whole cosmos from an ontic point of view or a scientific point of view, which is futile, let's look at those. What the fascination is, what calls to us, are those places we can't describe scientifically. That's where the mystery is, and it's mystery that drives the real thinker with a passion. What is this stuff? What does it mean? And that's where the aesthetics comes back in. That's where we're not going to know the cosmos objectively. That's never, ever going to happen. But we can know what it is in its essence, which is not gigantic. It's small. It's being. And from being, everything else comes. How do we understand it? We understand it aesthetically. It's in a Beethoven symphony, which has more truth to it than both volumes of Relativity by Einstein. It's in the great poetry. That's where we understand the nature of being and what we are coming out of that essence, which we've only just begun.
Oh yeah, and that actually, so for me, they would push back against that. I would say that which you have noticed, it is actually not a mistake. It's actually we ought to make sense of things. It's actually how we ought to understand the world, right? Because our relationship, the relationship of our cognition and the wider cosmos, is that one of our symbol, right? So what we do is like we
The
exactly.
nature of our rational cognition, not the aesthetic cognition.
But I'm arguing that actually all of them are unified. So when I talk about human cognition, I'm talking about all the
Mm-hmm.
mental faculties of the human being. So all of the
Right.
senses and all the intuitions, right? All the reasoning, so the cerebral, right? And all the feelings, the
Yes.
limbic, all of the PD and all subjectivity. So that's all of that. Our entire, should I call it mental life, our mental experiential life, our entire existential existence, all of them are unified under the umbrella of human cognition,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even the baby in the womb has human
But the point I
cognition.
was
The
making is
man.
we have wrongly split that cognition when we went from A is A to A equals A. We split the cognition, and in doing so, we split our own nucleus.
Yeah, and I'm saying like that's part of the process. Like that's how it's supposed to work. That is that whole thing of you break it up to understand a small aspect, then you could reconsolidate them, and there's that cycle of experience of separating and unifying, right? And so you do Newtonian mechanics. Then from Newtonian mechanics, you go and do quantum mechanics. Then after quantum mechanics, you'll find that there's a certain barrier to it that you can't work with, and something new has to come into its place. Right? So there's that constant cycle, that constant creation of symbols, that constant language or development of language, right? And so I'm saying that it's not a mistake. It's
Yes,
part of the process. It's
it
what we were meant
is.
to be. Yeah.
But there's a different. I think this crisis of quantum mechanics is somewhat different, um, in that it takes us to the limit. There's nothing we can do with objective rational thought that is going to penetrate into this any further, because we cannot even come up with metaphors that are free from space and time. We know that the space and time doesn't exist elementally, yet we talk of quantum fields, which, a quantum field assumes space and time. We can't even come up with the metaphor for what that actually is in physical reality, which means that this split has led us in one direction to a dead end, um, and a new type of thinking needs to take place, because we're not going to understand it, um, so, rationally, objectively, because it defies logic. And if it defies logic in mathematics, our objective our objective mode of knowledge, which was split from the aesthetic, it becomes impotent. It can't penetrate. But yet it's that mystery that draws us as human beings in an aesthetic way.
Yeah, but then that is if actually I would say that it's not beyond. It's not that it's beyond logic, rather it's beyond a type of naturalism, right? And you
Well,
find that,
no, tell me how
yeah, for example, if
logic.
I do digital physics, right?
How would logic? I mean, the problem is logic for 100 years has completely failed to explain quantum mechanics. We know through the formula that the probabilities work. We don't have a clue why that is, because at that level, we have superposition, which negates the principle of identity, or we have no space, we have no time. Logic depends on those things. How could we? I don't see how logic can possibly penetrate a realm where there's no causality, there is no identity principle, there is no space, there is no time. How is logic ever going to explain that? It's failed for 100 years. Are you still there, Afro? I'm not hearing.
Could you repeat? Like I think you broke up a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Uh,
Um, what
you're
I'm
saying
what
how
I'm
less than the.
asking, yeah, how can logic
I'm
be
having
applied to
some.
that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Now I
Oh, okay.
can't.
Yeah. So. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So now, okay. How does logic apply to this?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Ooh, okay. Yeah. So the first step is usually identifying objects, right? What is this thing that I'm looking at? What's this thing that I'm seeing? So when you say we were working with superpositions, right? Um,
Okay.
well, basically, technically, I'm indirectly critiquing Lawrence Krauss. Yeah, when he talks about this, we can say what he describes as the state of nothing, right? Nothing in quotes. Yeah, so the nothing in the sense of
Mm-hmm.
Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing. There are still entities
Right.
operating within it, right? And these entities are in flux, right?
Right.
Yeah, these
Yes.
flux have particular relations with each other, right? And yeah, yeah, and because our perception of these entities' relations to each other is inadequate, it tells us that there's another layer beyond it. Whenever a system cannot be explained in part
Does
of
it
itself,
really?
it's usually
Does it
indication
really
of a
tell
layer
us
beyond it.
there's another layer? Or
Uh,
does it tell us we just simply can't understand it?
yes, because at the end of the day, can we say that all those activities are arbitrary?
Yeah, we can.
No, I thought that possibly, because we would say that they are accidental. They can be accidental, but I wouldn't think of them as arbitrary. If we are working from the position of what we know, if we're working from our experience, if we are positing something that is beyond experience, something that is beyond knowledge, something that is beyond understanding, then we have basically ended up in the same place that the ancients ended up. That is the realm of the divine. That is the realm of chaos. That's the realm of God.
Not necessarily, though. I don't see it that way. I think that's a metaphysical assertion that in as metaphysics,
Mhm.
it's lost its ground. It's an assertion that's purely a conjecture. It's metaphysics is the realm of non-ground. Ground is in the physical. And that's where, I mean, Grund. I mean, we're on the ground. It's physical. Metaphysics is not grounded. And that's its whole problem. You can say that that is the realm of divinity, that is the realm of God. But there's no compelling reason for somebody to accept that. We don't see that. What we see is a bunch of particles with affinities, and those affinities kind of move it toward probabilities in relations with other particles or other waves, and it's chaotic. It's purely chaotic. We see nothing beyond that, nor is there a need for there to be anything beyond that. We simply can't conceive it because we can't conceive in those terms. But that doesn't mean there's something beyond it or that there's a God.
Well, but that gives you an odd dilemma. But okay, but
Mm-hmm.
if you put ground, yeah, because if you put ground on the if you put ground on the physical, right? It means the physical must entail everything. That's what ground
Yes,
implies, right?
exactly.
Yes.
It
So
does. And that's what I'm saying.
yeah, so everything must be entailed in the physical. But however,
Yes.
from our experience and our observations, that doesn't appear to be the case, right? Because if the grounding is pure, though actually, in the sense, the way you define the physical, if the physical is the set of cosmos, then of course everything is grounded within the cosmos, and there's a layer of cosmos that we are not able to perceive. So if we have this cosmos that is everything, and everything is physical, then the ground lies outside of human cognition, and it's a layer. I
Yes.
would say it's a layer. Yeah, it's a layer below what you're calling the quantum.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Um, I would say it lays in that same level, but isn't approachable other than through aesthetic meditation. That science, it's beyond our capacity to objectify, but it doesn't mean it's a different layer. It goes beyond what objectification can penetrate. It's the same layer. It's the same being. I'm not sure there even are layers. It's just simply that's what it is. So we go to aesthetic thought. We go to poetry. We go to music. We go to meditation. That is not a split between rationality and emotion, and that is the path we need to learn to explore rather than invent other layers that we can't even get to and have no reason to believe exist. One of the
Fascinating enough,
problems of metaphysics is that it takes our limited cognition from an objective point of view and projects it where it doesn't belong. Our reason says, well, there must be another layer that explains all this. Well, no. I mean, Kant and his antinomies showed the fallacy of that. Um, Transcendental illusion is an illusion because it tries to understand what cannot be understood um, objectively, representationally. It just simply can't be understood that way. And that's why this is where Wittgenstein and Heidegger come to saying almost the same thing, and that is be quiet before that which can't be spoken, which means don't go into metaphysical explanations that will bring up more illusory problems and further close off being. That would be the mistake, in my opinion.
Yeah. And fascinating enough, those things that you describe that lead to the errors explorations, they're actually the same things as religious disciplines, right? When people are worshiping God or contemplating God, what do? They sing, they paint, they dance, right? They hug one another, they help each other out, right? And so all these,
That's an interesting point. Yeah, in some religions, yes, in fact, they do, and that's bringing back the Dionysian, but naively, not understanding that that's what they're doing. Um, but Christianity in general is not that. It's a Western Christianity is a metaphysical invention of the early medieval period. It brought in first Plato and then Aristotle and built a metaphysical framework from which it deduces everything else, and that deduction turned out to lead us to all kinds of metaphysical or transcendental illusion. But you are right that a part of that Dionysian spirit, which is innate, it's part of being itself, still finds its way through without announcing its name.
yeah. And then another element to add it, like in particular, specifically since we have shifted a bit to critiquing Christianity, you find fascinating enough. What does it mean to be a Christian and what does it mean to be practicing Christian, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's the ethical side of it all, right? But then there's the experience side of it all. So in terms the metaphor I used to describe Christianity is that there are four layers. So there's a universal layer, there is the public layer, there's the private layer, and there's the personal layer. And so the push towards the personal is now that what you call the Dionysian spirit, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the Christian attempts to become one with God or one through the Holy Spirit, right? So they want to get that oneness. And that is done through the practice of virtue, right? And then that is expressed through prayer, through thanksgiving, through song, right? If you read the New Testament, right? Sing a
Yes,
new song unto the Lord.
I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And
In
so, but
fact, I
yeah,
would say, if I could just interject real quickly, and then I want to hear the rest of what you have to say.
yeah.
Is one of the Christian thinkers that I have the highest respect for is Søren Kierkegaard, who said
Yeah.
Christianity would have been far better off if it had realized it was purely irrational and not tried to deduce itself from metaphysics. Um, if Christianity had just followed the notion of Holy Spirit and expanded it without all the metaphysical baggage that was holding it down, it would have had a very different development, and I think a very positive development. Unfortunately, that's not the path that it took.
Yeah. Yeah. But then there are actually two threads, right? So there's the irrational side, the irrational exploration, right? Which Kierkegaard,
Right.
the Kierkegaard, I would describe it as perfection. And personally, I see the conflict between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is that Kierkegaard sees virtue as perfection, Nietzsche sees virtue as power, right? Strength, will to power. Yeah.
Ah, it's yeah. Nietzsche is far more. That's a whole different subject. And
I
to
understand
reduce it to,
yeah.
I think Heidegger is wrong in reducing it to power. It's far,
Yeah.
it's broader and more nuanced than that. But that's a whole other. Das ist ein weites
Yeah.
Feld. It's a
I'm trying to yeah. I'm trying to summarize genealogy of morals, right? So I'm
Yeah.
trying to, I'm contrasting fear and trembling with the genealogy of morals. So if I'm
Okay.
looking through genealogy, yeah, if I'm looking through genealogy of morals, it gives me the impression that virtue is strength, master morality, will, power, the capacity to actualize that which you wish, right? In contrast to fear and trembling, where you're approaching this perfect thing, and that perfect thing is changing you and it's making you perfect. It's making you into the knight of faith, in quotes, right? And so
Hmm.
that's how I'm presenting that dichotomy. And when I'm looking into the New Testament and its relationship to the Old Testament and with the church fathers, it appears that there are two threads to the Christian. There are two threads that he has to follow. There is the irrational aspect, the perception aspect, right?
Hmm.
The experience aspect, yeah, the kingdom of God, right? So that's one angle that the Christian has to follow. But he also has to reconcile that with the rational aspect. And you find that in Tolkien, in The Lord of the Rings. You find that in C.S. Lewis, in the Chronicles of Narnia, as well as in the Space Trilogy, right? So you see
Yes.
Christian
Yes.
thinkers saying that that the Christian man has to follow both the irrational side and the rational side. And the rational side defines the public expression of the faith. But then the irrational side defines the personal, the private aspect of the faith. And so under Christianity, all threads are unified under this one thing. And that's why you even find this fascinating thing whereby the Gnostics try to come up with like a Christianized version of them, right? Uh,
Hmm.
the Arabic pagans try to come up with their Christianized version of the thing, and it becomes Islamic, right? Um, like in Africa, like everywhere else, you find people try to merge the pagan with the Christian, and they end up with this strange syncretic thing that is neither pagan or Christian, right? Even the same thing happens in Rome,
Okay.
right? So they try to
Yes, that's right.
reconcile the pagan, yeah, but then they end up with something that is neither, right? But then, so which is actually the funny warning that Jesus gives when he is in the New Testament, right? That eventually false messiahs, false Christ, and false prophets will come to you saying they are me, right? And
Hmm.
if Jesus is indeed the Logos, and all these people come and say that I am the Logos, he's warning the people that this system that I'm instituting and the way of following this system is such that when you try to mix it up with something else, because there's a pull within it, it can express itself with every culture. It can have a public face that has multiple forms. So you can have a European Christianity, you can have an African Christianity, but then there is still that thread of it that requires you to give yourself completely to it and shed away these other things that you hang on to it, that you are hanging on to. So it filters away certain elements in cultural practice. And in my personal assessment, it is the most complete union of the irrational aspect of human coordination and the rational aspect of the human coordination. And it forces people to come together. Like I don't know if I read Rene Girard or John Milbank, right? When they talk about
Hmm.
how the Christian religion like subverts certain pagan practices, and it creates this new unity, right? Whereby it yeah, so you have a myth that is based on truth and experience, rather than a myth that is based on a noble lie and a sacrificial scapegoat, right? And that's why even when Christianity is introduced, you find there's that emphasis on the life of Jesus as a historical figure, and the resurrection a real historical event with witnesses. So that ties it into the realm of the physical and human experience, and it's within the physical realm of human experience is where our irrationality and our rationality merge into one unified thing.
Yeah, I know. I understand what you're saying, and
Yeah,
to a certain degree, I'm in sympathy with it. But here's
yeah,
my problem: is it still is working from a metaphysical foundation. It's making metaphysical assertions such as there is a God, Jesus was that God, and that is going to wrongly color our experience. It could lead us into false interpretation. Um, one of the things I hold with Heidegger is that we don't yet know the questions concerning morality, and that's an important issue. But without understanding the essence of being and our own essence as beings from being, without understanding that, we don't have the ground for morality. It's not something that's going to be systematized. It's not something that's going to be approached metaphysically. It's something that needs to be experienced, and through the meditation of the essences, we can learn about it, but we don't know much about it right now. But we feel it. Morality is a sensibility. And it can be refined over time, but it's a sensibility. We don't deduce our way to moral judgments. We feel it in our gut. It's an aesthetic. Morality is at its basis an aesthetic. And it's through that meditation on the aesthetic of morality that we can learn something. I use this example all the time, and it's the most striking example I can think of, and that's in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. At the end, when Yalosha has gathered the children after these horrible, horrible events, and he is most passionately telling them that we have to love each other. It is the most aesthetically powerful experience of morality that I've ever encountered. And yes, he comes in there. Dostoevsky was a devout Christian, but at that moment, he transcends Christianity and goes straight to being. I would say, it's through examples like that we learn morality. And what we learn is it isn't a law. There is no objective moral law, um, because there are no laws to the universe, really. It's in flux, but there's a gut, an essence in us that can direct us. And yeah, it does revolve around love and empathy and understanding. That is from our experience the key. But I can understand that more from that experience than I can through a religious mythology, one that makes me accept metaphysical assertions that I don't find at all compelling.
Yeah, but one area that I could push back in your response is particularly saying that Christianity starts from metaphysics. Rather, I would say it starts
Mm-hmm.
from experience, right? Yeah, because what is the starting point? It starts off with the life of this man that eventually they come to the conclusion that this man is the logos, is the embodiment of the logos, right? So that comes later. They start from experience, and it's through reflecting upon the experience that they come to the metaphysics, and that metaphysics generate a new experience, which will again generate a new metaphysics. So there's that feeding off of experience to metaphysics and back again, right? And so, for example, yeah, yeah. So let's say
Um,
in your
Go ahead.
yeah. So in every individual's crystal, the same process plays out. A bit different from those people's experience because that was theirs. So the modern Christian, most of them have never encountered Jesus or met Jesus, right? There's some who believe
Right.
that they have, but yeah. Some believe that they do, and some will say that it's in the realm of the spirit that they encountered him, right? Uh, it's hard to verify or disprove any of those claims, but ultimately you can see that cycle of an experience to a metaphysic and back again to an experience. So it's not divorcing the two, but rather that it's something that you have to navigate both. So with their discipline, why do they read the Bible, right? Why do they go to church on Sunday? Do they want to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the prisoner? Is that dialectic, that dialogue of experience and metaphysics feeding off each other?
Yeah, I think first of all, let me say we've gone for an hour and 15 minutes, so we're at a point where we probably should break this, but we leave it at a
Yeah,
very interesting point. Um, to what
yeah.
degree is Christianity authentic, and what to what degree is it metaphysics. And I think you and I have a very different view of how metaphysics came about in Christianity. And I don't find metaphysics in the Old Testament, although I find modern interpretations of it to be metaphysical. But Christianity, as it has been handed down in the West, I believe is a metaphysical construction and errors because of it. But perhaps, would you be willing to come back another time, maybe in a few weeks, and we address that point? Would you be willing to do that?
Oh yeah, yeah, it'll be an interesting discussion.
I have to, yeah, we have just begun to touch the surface. I, I have to say, I very much enjoy this conversation. You more than hold up your end. You're a very bright guy who knows what he's talking about. Um, we probably have more points of agreement than are apparent right now, and I want to reach those. And we have some very fundamental disagreements, but that's what makes it interesting. So again, Afro, I really want to thank you for being here. I very much enjoyed this conversation, and I want to pick it up on this very point. The history of metaphysics in Christianity and the degree to which it's inherent. Is that agreeable to
Yeah.
you?
Oh yeah, yeah, that'd be a fun topic. Yeah. And
Yeah, I
it'll be a
think
good thing
so
for me to
too.
read.
I'm sorry?
I
Say
said
it again,
it'll be
please.
a good thing for me to
Oh,
read through. Yeah, yeah, like the history
yeah,
of metaphysics,
yeah,
how it relates to
yeah,
yeah, that'd be good
I
for me.
agree. All right, well, we're going to cut it for now because, like, we've gone almost an hour 20, and we can never keep an audience that long.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad we got to know each other on that thread, and I really look forward to the continuation of this. And with that, we'll end it. Thank you so much again, Afro, and we'll see each other soon. Okay, bye.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Godspeed. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
too.